Look how they massacred my boy.
Today we are gathered to mourn a great loss in the video game space, and that is The Lord of the Rings Gollum. This was a tragic event that happened a few weeks ago. This game released in a horrible, broken, unfinished state with lackluster content, plenty of bugs, and very negative public response. And frankly, it's a sad day for us all. So this is a topic that's been very heavily documented. It's an incredibly spectacular failure in a year in which we've seen many video games release in poor and unoptimized states. This one has really stood out among that crowd even as just being on another level of, whether you call it incompetence. There's just been basically nothing but negativity surrounding this. Pretty sad, honestly, for someone who's a big fan of the Lord of the Rings as a series, and I think the potential for Lord of the Rings video games is really great. I know this is a topic that many have gone over, but as just a fan of Gollum and the Lord of the Rings, I just wanted to give my own opinion on it, because it really is, it's just a very unique and frankly horrible situation. It's just something that needs to be discussed, it really is. So when this was first announced quite a few years ago, I thought, wow, that's frankly awesome. If you look at so many of the Lord of the Rings video games that have released, especially recently, there haven't been that many, but in the past 10 or so years, the most notable ones were the Shadow of Mordor series and then the sequel Shadow of War. And those games were very well received. I've played them and I really like them. But one thing about them is that they're pretty generic in terms of how do they utilize the Lord of the Rings branding. Those games honestly don't really even need to be set in the world of the Lord of the Rings to function. The main character really kind of just feels like a dollar store version of Aragorn, which is kind of lame. Doesn't really make a lot of sense, and there's a lot of other weird lore stuff in that, like how Shelob is now just a normal lady. Lots of strangeness like that. Even though I really enjoy those games and they have some really great mechanics, like the Nemesis orc mechanics, they don't feel, to me, too authentic to the world of Lord of the Rings, and I feel like there's more potential there. It doesn't really feel like it's set in that world most of the time. It doesn't really have that core of emotion and actual, story like the source material does by J.R.R. Tolkien. And so I heard about this Gollum game and I'm like, that's a really great idea. I think this is what has motivated me the most to talk about this, is that I've seen so many comments and other opinions of who in their right mind would want to play a video game as Gollum. Who is that person? Who is this made for? Let me answer that question for you. It's me. I love Gollum. He is, I think, one of the most compelling literary characters ever written. I think he was adapted to the screen beautifully in the Peter Jackson films. So I see no issue with there being a sort of story-based game featuring Gollum. I think as a concept, that's phenomenal. And certainly could have been executed exceptionally well if the right development team was behind it and they were given enough time and resources. As we can see, that is not what happened. And, I think just in terms of pop culture relevance, Gollum is hugely influential and recognizable. If you ask basically anyone on the street to give you a quotation from The Lord of the Rings, you'll probably get one of three things. You might get one to not simply walk into Mordor. Someone might say, "You shall not pass." And then you're probably also going to get someone saying, "My precious." Because you know what? It's a very iconic line, and that character is extremely memorable and disturbing, and a huge part of those films. He's an extremely compelling character, so I find it really insulting that so many comments and other videos I've seen online have claimed that there's no place for Gollum to be in a video game. I think that's really short-sighted. I disagree with that assessment wholeheartedly. It's just clear that with this specific project, the stars were very much not aligned, and it led to disaster. And you know what? I would have liked to even play this game just to give it a shot, but I can't even do that because the minimum specifications to play this title are beyond my computer's capabilities. I don't have the beefiest computer certainly, but it runs basically everything else just about fine. And even on really high-end hardware, I've seen it does not run especially well, and that includes even on the current-gen consoles like the Xbox and the PS5. So it's just not cool. And the reason for that pretty clearly is that the developer Daedalic, they're a very small studio who've only worked on 2D games, and then they go from that to working on this huge franchise, a type of game that hasn't been done before. I will say there's a few things I can compliment. I think the idea is sound. There's some mechanical ideas that are quite exciting, like the idea of having a sort of good and evil system between Gollum and Smeagol, where you can choose different actions based on each of the two sides of his personality. That just fits so well within a video game framing. We've seen that kind of mechanic in several other story-based games, and it just would make a lot of sense for a Gollum video game. And setting it where they do, and in between The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, is a very natural place to set a Gollum video game. If you want to tell a story that elaborates on that, that makes a lot of sense. This is basically one of the first major Lord of the Rings pieces of media since the film's release in the early 2000s that doesn't take direct visual inspiration from them, which isn't a bad thing. I love the way the films look, but obviously when you're adapting a book, it doesn't have to look only one way. But in the past 20 years, the majority of it has been lifted from the Peter Jackson films, so it is refreshing to see new takes on some classic characters and locations. Like Gandalf looks quite a bit different. Gollum himself, you can tell that they did take some inspiration from Andy Serkis's Gollum, but he has a distinct look, and I don't know if that look is perfect, but I do appreciate that they tried to do their own thing with it. And also the voice actor for Gollum isn't doing a direct Andy Serkis impression. It sounds somewhat similar, but it's clearly distinct, and I think that's cool. So yeah, it's not without value, and some of the location designs look pretty cool. But, it just hasn't come together. Many of the visual elements look pretty unfinished. Like the UI looks pretty noticeably dated. It looks pretty amateurish. And then there's some pretty gross microtransaction stuff. The base game is $50 on Steam, but then you have to pay $3 for emotes, lore compendium, and alternate Elvish voice acting. You see it a lot with many other modern games, but it's bad there and it's bad here. And it really doesn't help this game's public perception. And it's just really unfortunate because I feel like I can tell by what I've seen, by footage I've seen, and interviews, that the developers did want to create something of a high quality and just were not able to. This game had several delays and pretty clearly a troubled development. I do hope someday we get some sort of insight into exactly what went wrong. At this point, we can basically speculate. Recently, there was some change of ownership with the Lord of the Rings intellectual property when the Embracer Group, which is basically a giant video game conglomerate, bought the rights to Lord of the Rings, which was crazy. I still don't know what the ramifications of that are going to be fully, but I don't know if that affected this at all. But at the end of the day, the game was released in a fairly obviously unfinished state, and that's just a major shame. I don't think this is the kind of thing where they can really fix it with patches, but it would certainly take a lot of time to get to a finished level from where it's at. I think more often than not, games are just left unfinished, and that's really a shame, and that's a practice that should really be discouraged in the industry. I think it devalues the brands to have something like this release that's so obviously unfinished and so poorly received. I don't know if I ever expected this to be regarded as the most amazing game ever. I was looking forward to it before release, even though the footage didn't look great. I thought, hey, maybe the story will be really good and maybe they'll be able to tune up the visuals before release. They were not. And the game apparently has several gameplay problems in terms of repetition and poorly done mechanics. It's just a sad state of affairs, and my poor boy Gollum does not deserve to be treated in this manner. I just hate to see people saying that a Gollum game could never work just because this one didn't. And yeah, that is the main point that I wanted to hammer home, is that it didn't have to be this way. And for whatever reason it was, and that's tremendously sad. These things happen. Obviously, I'll live, but you know what? I really was looking forward to playing this, and at this point, I just can't bring myself to pay that much money for it. Given that the likelihood of me having a positive experience with it is exceptionally low. Smeagol, his name has been tarnished, and I'm very sad about that. I really don't appreciate the association that the character Gollum is going to have with a unfinished game, which many people really did not like. It's just an unfortunate situation, and what more is there to say than that? Okay, I'll be seeing you. This has been an Onion Creature video.